In America, where literally we're getting sicker, heavier, more depressed, more infertile every year.
RFK Jr. says that he wants to make America healthy again.
Don't you want healthy children? And don't you want the chemicals out of our food? And don't you want a president that's going to make America healthy again?
Are modern foods making us sick? The answer is surely yes. And yet hardly any politicians except for RFK Jr. are talking about it. So here on The Nexus, we will be discussing it with two world-famous experts, starting with the eminent professor, Robert Lustig, who has some very simple advice on what to eat and what to avoid.
When we look at food, protect the liver, feed the gut, and support the brain.
We'll also be speaking to a top heart surgeon about the carnivore diet. Philip Ovadia is on the diet himself and has carried out thousands of operations. He believes eating just meat can reverse all kinds of chronic diseases.
People who are doing ketogenic carnivore diets, they reverse their insulin resistance, they reverse their diabetes.
But first, let's hear more from RFK Jr. He pulled out of the race for the White House a couple of weeks ago and is now hoping to get a job with Donald Trump if he wins in November. They're both promising to make America healthy again, with RFK Jr. leading the crusade against Big Pharma and Big Food. Would his uncle JFK, an icon of the Democrat Party, be proud? Perhaps.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
When my uncle was president, I was a boy. A typical pediatrician would see one case of diabetes during his entire career. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic. 74% of Americans are now overweight or obese, and 50% of our children. In Japan, the childhood obesity rate is 3%. 120 years ago, when somebody was obese, they were sent to the circus.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. may not have the same way with words as his uncle JFK, but after pulling out of the presidential race on the promise of a job from Donald Trump, the most high-profile member of America's unofficial royal family is on what he describes as a spiritual journey to cure America.
2/3 of American adults and children suffer from chronic health issues. 50 years ago, that number was less than 1%. We are mass poisoning all of our children and our adults.
RFK Jr. is very open about who he blames for America's descent into chronic ill health.
First and the worst is ultra-processed food. The second culprit is toxic chemicals in our food and our medicine.
Ultra-processed food is the kind churned out in factories containing ingredients you won't find in the kitchen cupboard, with extra fat, salt, sugar and flavour added to get consumers hooked.
Laboratory scientists who many of them formerly worked for the cigarette industry, which purchased all the big food companies in the 1970s and 80s, deployed thousands of scientists to figure out new chemicals to make the food more addictive.
An estimated 73% of the American diet now comes from these food sources, which make you fat because they're full of empty calories and strange chemicals, but sick because they contain almost none of the nutrition needed to keep us healthy.
77% of school lunches are processed foods. There's no vegetables.
A typical meal given to students in an American school will include breakfast cereals, fruit juice, chicken nuggets, corn dogs, and frozen pizza. These processed foods can pass nutritional guidelines because, for example, the tomato sauce on the pizza can be counted as a vegetable, or tinned peaches in syrup as a fruit.
Why are we allowing this to happen to our children?
The other industry which benefits from a sick nation is Big Pharma.
These agencies, the FDA, USDA, and CDC, all of them are controlled by giant for-profit corporations.
The cycle is simple and devastating. Big Food gets people sick, Big Pharma provides the drugs to treat them. The money rolls in. These industries' links to the government are no conspiracy theory. Here's the issue: the Federal Food and Drug Administration is in part funded by the companies it regulates. The agency gets 75% of its funding from the fees pharmaceutical companies pay when they apply for approval for a medical device or drug. Over the past 40 years, 9 out of the last 10 FDA commissioners have gone on to work for the pharmaceutical industry. RFK Jr. says he wants to put an end to these links.
President Trump's backing. I'm going to change that. We're going to staff these agencies with honest scientists. I promise that within 4 years, America will be a healthy country. I won't fail.
Right, let's hear from Professor Lustig now, a professor of pediatric endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He's one of the leading experts on diet and health, and his books and podcasts have been enjoyed by millions around the world. Professor Lustig, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Matthew.
RFK Jr. is saying that the big agriculture and big food is poisoning, mass poisoning millions of Americans. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with it. The question is, how do you define poison? So most people think that food is food. Unfortunately, food can also be poison. And the question is, how do you tell which is which? Well, first question, what is everyone consuming? What is America consuming? What is the UK consuming? Well, 67% of food in America is now ultra processed. 62% of food in the UK is ultra processed. And so the question then becomes, since that's the majority, is ultra processed food food? And the answer is, first you have to know the definition of food. Well, the definition is substrate that contributes to either growth or burning of an organism. Well, it turns out that the sugar in ultra-processed food, which is the single biggest ingredient, actually poisons the little powerhouses of the cells, the mitochondria. So in fact, it actually inhibits burning. And we now have data to show that it actually inhibits statural growth as well. So if a food does not contribute to growth and does not contribute to burning, is it a food? Turns out, no, it's a poison. So in fact, RFK Jr. does have a point about the food industry, because the single thing that they have added to food for their purposes, not for yours, is sugar. And ultra-processed food is the vehicle.
And I know you've been arguing that sugar is extremely dangerous for many years now. And the ultra-processed food is very easy to grasp and identify if you use the NOVA groups, which you've mentioned in many of your podcasts. Could you explain the NOVA grouping of processed foods?
Absolutely. So my colleague, Dr. Carlos Montero, who's an epidemiologist at the University of Sao Paulo, did the world a great service by, instead of categorizing food by its nutrients, he categorized food by the degree of processing. And he called it the NOVA system, just means new. And there are 4 classes. So the best way to explain it is with an example. So let's take an apple. NOVA class 1 would be an apple picked off a tree. NOVA class 2 would be apple slices, destemmed, deseeded, deskinned possibly. NOVA class 3 would be apple sauce, macerated, possibly cooked with maybe a preservative, possibly with added sugar. And NOVA class 4 would be a McDonald's apple pie. So the question is, how much of that NOVA class 1 apple do you find in the NOVA class 4 McDonald's apple pie? Only McDonald's knows for sure if there's any apple in there in the first place. Well, it turns out that NOVA class 4, that grouping, is responsible for virtually every chronic metabolic disease on the planet. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, lipid problems, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease. The diseases that chew through 75% of all healthcare costs in the US and the UK are due to that NOVA class 4 distinction. And that is 75% of all healthcare costs made by 73% of the items in the American grocery store.
So when people look and pick their food, they can keep the NOVA group model in their minds, or they can also use your golden rule for picking food, if you want to explain that.
So we actually did a full analysis of the entire ultra-processed food landscape. in order to help a company in the Middle East become a metabolically healthy company. Company is known as Kuwaiti Danish Dairy. It's run by a UK national, Sir Mohammed Jafar, who wants to bring the food industry into the 21st century. And he asked us if we would help him. And in the process, we developed a set of rubrics, a set of principles by which you can identify ultra-processed food. Ultimately, food must do three things to be healthy: protect the liver, feed the gut, support the brain. Any food that does all three is healthy, whether it's processed or not. Any food that does none of the three is poison, whether it's processed or not. And any food that does one or two, but not all three, will be somewhere in the middle. And the question then becomes, can you take an ultra-processed food and make it healthy? And the answer is yes, but the food industry is not doing it right now. And so the processed food continues to be poison.
In his speech, RFK mentioned that the big regulatory agencies that are supposed to keep an eye on big food and big pharma are actually quite corrupt. They've been captured by those industries and are therefore unable to do their job. Is that true?
Indeed, you take a look and you could see that the head of the FDA, the head of the USDA, they all come from either pharma or from big food in the first place. They set up shop in DC and then they leave, and it's known as regulatory capture or agency capture. We have seen this. It's true in many different agencies throughout the United States and likely in Britain as well. The bottom line is that in order for government to be able to assist the public, they have to be able to understand what the problem is. And for the last 50 years, they have been told that dietary fat is the problem and that sugar is exonerated. The fact of the matter is, it's the exact opposite. Dietary fat is not the problem, and sugar is actually the culprit. We now have decades of research to demonstrate the very specific toxic properties, the mitochondrial toxic properties of sugar. In addition, for ultra-processed food, we have learned that emulsifiers are also toxic. They're what hold fat and water together. That's like a detergent. What happens when you swallow a detergent? You burn a hole in your intestine. Well, that's why we all have what we call leaky gut, and why we are all chronically inflamed is because our gut is in such bad shape. So the whole process, the whole concept of ultra-processed food is basically supplying us with the poisons that are driving all of these chronic diseases.
Professor Lustig, we're going to be hearing from a heart surgeon in Florida who's on the carnivore diet and says it does him the world of good, does his patients the world of good. What do you think of it?
So I am not an adherent or a proponent of any specific diet. I have no problem with the carnivore diet. And the reason is because it protects the liver, feeds the gut, and supports the brain. There are some issues with the carnivore diet, particularly if you have some lipid metabolic problems, such as familial hypercholesterolemia, which is 1 in 500 people. And so no one should go on a carnivore diet without discussing it with their doctor first. But there are many, many potential benefits for the carnivore diet, especially if you manifest the problems of metabolic syndrome, that is insulin resistance and chronic metabolic disease, such as type 2 diabetes.
Just a final question about RFK Jr. He spoke very passionately about all these subjects, which are also dear to your heart. Do you think he has what it takes to make a difference if he gets that opportunity with Trump?
I'm afraid not. And the answer is RFK Jr. understands the role that the environment plays in disease. And to that, I give him great credit. He is an environmental lawyer and has worked in this field for several decades now. And so, he understands the problem. And I appreciate that he is trying to do something about it. Unfortunately, his stance on vaccines is so completely outlandish that it has actually ruined his credibility with the American public. And by the way, Donald Trump is not going to change anything. He likes his McDonald's cheeseburgers a little too much.
Professor Lustig, thank you so much for your analysis today. Much appreciated. Now, as we promised at the top of the programme, we're going to have a look at the carnivore diet. Is eating meat, butter, fish and eggs really the healthiest diet in the world? There's been so much bad press about it, especially red meat, it's hard to believe it is. And yet, the carnivore diet appears to be growing more and more popular, and there are countless videos online of people losing weight and apparently curing themselves of all kinds of chronic diseases.
I went back to the same weight that I was when I was 26, and my psoriasis disappeared. And I had floaters in my right eye, and they cleared up. I'm better now, probably, than I've ever been in my life, and I haven't been taking antidepressants for a whole year.
Okay, let's bring in cardiac surgeon Dr. Philip Ovadia. He's performed over 3,000 operations and is a big supporter of the carnivore diet. And we also have Sophie Medlin, a consultant dietitian, who thinks it's actually quite dangerous. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Sophie, I'm going to have a quick chat with the good doctor here. I want you to listen to his experiences, and then you can raise your concerns with him. So, Dr. Philip Ovadia, why would a heart surgeon of all people switch to the carnivore diet, as you have done, some years ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really comes down to my own health struggles. Go back 10 years and I was a morbidly obese, pre-diabetic heart surgeon. And I realized that I was going to end up on my own operating table, so to speak. And I was following the advice that I had been educated to give my patients, probably very similar to how Sophie's been educated to counsel her patients. You know, we've heard it, eat less, move more, eat a low-fat diet. It wasn't working for me, and it wasn't working for my patients. And I started looking for some different information. I came across, the concept of low-carb diets first. That really led me to the importance of eating whole, real food, avoiding the processed foods that I know we've just been having a discussion around. And ultimately, I came to the carnivore diet because I realized that animal protein is the most nutrient-dense source that humans can eat. It is our ancestral food that we have been eating for millions of years. And most importantly, it's what improved my health most. It's what got me feeling my best. Now, 7 years later, the results continue to speak for themselves, both my results and the results of the patients that have been doing this as well. And I have seen reversals of all sorts of chronic conditions like diabetes, like many autoimmune disorders. And I have seen people that have the same experience that I do, that they achieve their best health when they are eating primarily animal protein, whole, real foods.
Sophie, good time to bring you in, really. What concerns do you have?
Sure. Well, I think we can all agree that actually a lot of the information that we've been fed about nutrition is perhaps not suited to our modern lifestyles. So, for example, in my lifetime as a dietitian, we have moved more towards understanding the need to reduce carbohydrates because we just don't use them during our modern lifestyles anymore. What I think is really frightening about the carnivore diet, and particularly coming from someone like yourself, is that we know that it increases LDL cholesterol in so many people. We also know that it leads to, which will in of itself lead to cardiac events. We also know that it can lead to kidney stones and gout and osteoporosis. So there are so many things that we have concerns around. And I would love to see how you justify to yourself. I don't mind what you do as a person, as an individual, but you giving this advice to your patients, which flies in the face of decades of research demonstrating that plants are such an important part of protecting our cardiovascular health. You're sort of going down this road, which is very niche and has very little research, and advising people against the best research that we have in this area.
Dr. Ovadia, could we just take point by point? Sophie mentioned cholesterol.
Sure thing.
Could you take that point first?
Yeah, I'd love to take that point first, because there are two things to understand there. First of all, there is no mechanism that has been put forward for how eating animal protein raises your cholesterol. The theory
but it does.
was that
when
saturated
we look at blood
fat. Yeah, the theory was that saturated fat in the meat would raise our blood cholesterol level. That has now been thoroughly disproven. Multiple studies have shown that there is no linkage between the amount of saturated fat that we eat and our dietary cholesterol level and our blood cholesterol levels. Sorry, I misspoke there. The second point to understand is that not all LDL cholesterol is the same. And in some circumstances, raised LDL cholesterol is problematic. And I would say that is in the context of things like inflammation, insulin resistance, and metabolic disease. And when you reverse your metabolic disease by eliminating what was causing it in the first place, the processed food and the high level of processed carbohydrates, then the evidence shows us that LDL may not be problematic. A recent study just published, the KETO trial, led by Dr. Matt Budoff, one of the most preeminent cardiovascular researchers, showed that in people on low-carb diets, there was no relationship between their level of LDL cholesterol and the amount of plaque that was in their coronary arteries. So this concept, the diet heart hypothesis, which has been the predominant theory around heart disease for the past 70 years, is being shown in multiple examples and now scientific studies that it may not be true in all circumstances.
Sophie?
And that's why I have no reservation in recommending this for my patients.
What I think concerns me there is that when we talk about inflammation, we know that some foods, particularly red meat, for example, is pro-inflammatory in the body. And sure, refined carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates. Let me finish my point. Sure, refined carbohydrates and processed foods are certainly more pro-inflammatory in the body than natural foods like red meats. However, when we look at the keto diet, we're talking about something that's really quite different to what you're promoting, which is essentially no fruits and vegetables. Whereas the keto diet may well include quite a lot of vegetables, actually. And I'm not saying that it's the sort of number one diet that I would recommend, especially as a gut health dietitian who sees the consequences of people on very low carbohydrate diets. However, fruits and vegetables are hugely anti-inflammatory in the diet. And if we're trying to promote people to reduce inflammation in their body, and on the other hand, trying to encourage them to cut out essentially fruits and vegetables, we're having a problem there.
Let's get Philip's response to that. Red meat, Sophie said, was inflammatory.
Yeah, I would ask her to show me the science because red meat has never been shown to be pro-inflammatory. The problem is that when you do epidemiologic studies, right, and people say they eat a lot of red meat, that is usually in the context of we'll call it the standard Western diet, the standard American diet. They're eating a hamburger with the bun, with the toppings, with the French fries, and they're drinking the soda with it. And we look at all that and we say the meat is pro-inflammatory. And we know it's all that other stuff that's pro-inflammatory. And one of the most consistent things that I see in my patients and in myself is eating only red meat, inflammation levels are incredibly low. And I test this, I measure it. We do blood work frequently, and reliably inflammation goes down when you eliminate the processed foods. I think that's something we agree upon. And the problem with the research around the fruits and the vegetables is that that is all in the context of if you are substituting processed food for fruits and vegetables, you see improvement. But that doesn't mean that the fruits and vegetables are what are causing the improvement. It's the elimination of the processed food. So if you carry that further and say, okay, we are eliminating processed food by doing a carnivore diet, we don't need the fruit and vegetable. The animal already ate the vegetables for us. They did the work for us. And we are getting the nutrients, which they are better suited to extract from those fruits and vegetables, right? They are ruminant animals. They have multiple stomachs and they can better extract the nutrients. One of the things that doesn't get talked about is all of these nutrients that are in plants. We as human beings do a very lousy job of utilizing those, of extracting them from the food. Because we only have one stomach, you know, the percent of all of these vitamins and nutrients that we talk about in plants, we get very little of that. We are much better suited to extract nutrients from animal products than we are from plant products.
Sophie, given what Dr. Ovadia has said and the studies he's referred to and so on, would you be open to looking at the carnivore diet for some of your patients?
No, I don't. I can't justify looking at these decades of research and all of the information that we have demonstrating that plants are so important for our general health, for fiber, for vitamins, for minerals. I mean, I'd be interested to know where you're getting your vitamin C from, for example.
Good. Let's ask that question. There isn't quite the same amount of vitamin C in meat as there is, say, in an orange or a strawberry.
Yeah, so it turns out that vitamin C is needed in higher quantities when you are trying to process carbohydrates, when your body is trying to process carbohydrates. And when you eliminate the carbohydrates, we don't need as much vitamin C. And another thing around vitamin C is the amount of vitamin C in animal products has been misunderstood because preserved animal products are very low in vitamin C. But fresh meat, non-preserved animal product actually has a decent amount of vitamin C in it. So again, I am yet to see a long-term carnivore who has developed scurvy, which is vitamin C deficiency. It just doesn't happen.
Come in, Sophie.
And in fact, when you go back to the science, you see that one of the treatments for scurvy was to eat fresh meat. It was only these sailors on these long voyages that only had preserved meat to eat. Those are the ones that develop scurvy.
I mean, I would love to see that research showing that fresh meat has vitamin C in it. But I think from my perspective, the studies that you've cited are on keto diets, which do include fruits and vegetables. To date, there is no research that suggests that the carnivore diet is safe and healthy. And having worked at King's College in research, I know that it would be really hard to even get ethical approval to study the carnivore diet, given how it completely contravenes all the best science that we have to date about what is safe and effective and the right things to be eating and drinking. So until you have proper studies demonstrating the benefits of carnivore diets and how it's doing things to people that are positive, it's going to be very difficult to justify your position.
I think there is.
Yeah, and you know what? I agree with Sophie 100% there. I would love to see research on the carnivore diet, but Sophie revealed one of the problems. There is such a bias against even considering this that the research doesn't get done. So instead, we have to turn to the case reports, the case series, the hundreds and now thousands of patients that are reversing their chronic conditions, improving their health, and doing great on this dietary approach. But I agree wholeheartedly.
In the short term,
I would love to see.
I will wait to see the long term.
I know people who have been on this diet for decades and are doing great. So I admit, you're right. It's not the large studies. Now, the interesting thing is there have been scientific studies done around this diet. They were just done long ago. In the 1920s, there was a observational study of two gentlemen, Vilmer Stephenson was one of them, who were observed in the hospital for a year, eating meat only, and showed great improvements in their health. And so you are right. I would love to have more research. I would love to the institutions being open to doing this research, but they are so biased against it that they won't even consider the possibilities because it shows how much is wrong with the science we have around nutrition today. And we need to acknowledge that the vast majority of science that has been done around nutrition is lousy science.
Dr. Ovadia, just one last question. RFK Jr. is hoping to get a post with Donald Trump should he win in November. He wants to clean up Big Pharma, and he also wants to clean up big agriculture. Do you think he has the qualifications to help American people in that way?
Yes, RFK has been very passionate about health for a long time now. And more so, I know he's talking to the right people like Callie Means, who understand what has gone wrong in our food system, how that's tied to our pharmaceutical system. And it's really been ingrained in the framework of our society. And I fully support what RFK is talking about, what he's doing. And I do hope that him and or any other politicians are willing to take up this battle and make the changes that we need to, because our health is literally destroying our society. And it's true here in the US, it's true in the UK, and it's really true in most developed nations that we are literally being bankrupt, and we have our children that are suffering from this. So it's a battle we need to fight.
Dr. Philip Ovadia and Sophie Medlin, thank you both very much for your contributions to The Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye and good health.